So some of you may remember the old Hair Club for Men commercial where the narrator said, "I'm not only the owner, I'm also a client." So I'm not only a prior paper presenter and now moderator of this panel, I'm also the executive director of the Liberty and Law Center here at the Scalia Law School, which is the sponsor of the Voices for Liberty initiative, which is sponsoring this program. So I wanted to take the opportunity to welcome everyone, both who are here in person and who are watching live via streaming or via C-SPAN, or who are watching in the recorded session to our Voices for Liberty program. This particular panel is based on a paper by Professor Claudia Williamson-Kramer, who will be joining us by Zoom in the background here, Spewing Hate or Speaking Tolerance, How Free Speech Affects Social Norms and Minority Rights. I'll give you a brief biography of the speakers, but I don't want to take up too much time. They're all very distinguished. If I went through their whole biographies and all their accomplishments, it would take up a good part of our session. So briefly, our paper author, Professor Kramer, is Scott L. Probasco Distinguished Chair of Free Enterprise and Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Economic Education at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Her main research interests lie at the intersection of applied economic development and political economy. A common thread in her work is the combination of incentive and knowledge arguments, revealing interesting and at times unconventional results. Our first commentator, Garrett Jones, is a colleague here at George Mason University. He is a professor of economics and BB&T professor for the study of capitalism at the Mercatus Center at this university. Among other accomplishments, Professor Jones is the author of 3 books, most recently, The Culture Transplant, How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones They Left. Our second commenter is Eugene Volokh. I noticed in the program he's still listed as a UCLA professor. Professor Volokh for 30 years was indeed a professor at UCLA School of Law, where he taught First Amendment law, copyright law, criminal law, tort law, and firearms regulation. As of this fall, however, he is the Thomas M. Siebel Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Most relevant to this symposium, Eugene is one of the leading, and I would argue the leading, First Amendment scholars in the United States. And with that, let me turn it over to Claudia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to, the encouragement to write this paper and then the opportunity to present this paper. I'll just provide kind of a brief overview of the structure and where the kind of status of the paper and the results are so far at this point. So right now, the way that the paper is structured, it really has 2 parts. What I'm trying to do is understand how preferences for free speech, people who believe in free speech, free expression, and prefer to not have some sort of censorship, how those attitudes also affect attitudes toward people of other races or ethnic groups. And then the second piece is to look at the national level policies. And so how does free speech protections, kind of legal protections of free speech, including free expression and academic freedom, how does that affect other legal policies, specifically legal policies that are intended to protect minority rights, and then also legal policies related to government discrimination. And so the way that I set up the paper is overall trying to kind of create these theoretical channels of influence. So how is it possible that free speech kind of influences our ways of thinking about people of other races or ethnic groups? And so within economics, and they draw on other social sciences. So broadly speaking, within the social sciences, the way you can think about it is there's kind of 2 related models based on persuasive communication. And so one is what we call a belief-based model, which is more, if you want to think of it as being more of a rational individual. And so in this type of model, having more information or more communication can't hurt an individual. And so in that case, persuasive communication and any sort of speech, whether it's false speech or misinformation, isn't going to lead to misbelief. So the rational agents, they update, and more information through a competitive process leads to, in some sense, think of better outcomes. And then we have what we call preference-based models, which is that that's not how people form their beliefs. In fact, they form their beliefs oftentimes based on appeal. They don't have a rational incentive to update information. And so things like rhetoric and propaganda can very easily influence people's biases and beliefs, including racial issues, for example. Within the economics literature, I would say kind of the largest piece of this is actually related to exploring the role of media freedom, specifically looking at how a media that is free from government interference leads to more government accountability. And then kind of the third piece within the theoretical channel of influence is to kind of understand how free speech is basically representing more of a culture of tolerance. So when we think about racial progress, or we think about how we treat one another, holding beliefs that you fundamentally think that you want to exist in a society and live in a society where the media and individuals are free to think and express what they believe, even if you would disagree with it. Holding that sort of fundamental viewpoint is representative of a culture of influence. So then the way that I go about trying to test this, I gather data across countries. And again, the first part of the analysis is looking at individual level survey data on people's beliefs. And so I do this in two different pieces. So kind of the way that I attacked this problem was to get as much data as I possibly could and see what happens. And so there's two large surveys that's occurred over time. One is called the Afrobarometer, and this was actually brought up from a prior discussant in one of our workshops over summer. They encouraged me to look at the Afrobarometer surveys. And so within these surveys, they have in one of the waves a question to the individuals, their views toward free speech. So do you agree with the statement that the media should be able to publish any view that they hold? Or do you think the government has the right and should basically censor what is being said and published, for example? And so I code this as preference for free speech. And then there's also a question related to in the literature, loosely what we call some version of either racial or ethnic tolerance. What they do is they ask kind of on a scale, would you strongly dislike someone of another ethnic group as your neighbor? And so then I look at these associations, and within this survey, it's done over the years 2014, 2015, and over 33 African countries. And what happens is that people who hold the viewpoint of media freedom or kind of free speech preferences also have more ethnically tolerant views. And so do a variety of kind of robustness tests with that, and the result does seem to hold. Move over to a different type of survey, very similar. It's called the Integrated Values Survey. So it's both the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey. These surveys started in 1981, and they just finished their last wave in 2022, in which I was able to actually update the results. They have a question related to kind of the importance of, and they list several different things: maintaining order, fighting inflation, protecting free speech as one of the options. And so I take and code individual responses that highlighted one of the most important things that their country can do is protect free speech, and then relate it to a similar question related to racial tolerance, measured on if you would not want to have someone of another race as your neighbor. Again, controlling for different demographic, socioeconomic variables, and that association holds. So there is, at least within this set of results of the paper, evidence speaking to more the idea that if you hold preferences and beliefs for free speech, you have more racially and ethnically tolerant views. Then the second part of the paper kind of shifts to look at national policies. And so we can think of it as beliefs and what our public opinion is going to shape country level national policies. And so that's the way to think about kind of tying these two parts of the paper together. And so countries, there's different measures for free speech. I use a measure from the Varieties of Democracy database, or VDEM, if you are familiar with that. And they measure, largely speaking, free speech, free expression, and academic freedom. Again, national level policies. And then I relate it to 5 different measures of what I just loosely call minority rights protections or government-based discrimination. And so what happens with these series of tests is that countries that have policies that protect free speech, they also have more legal protections for minorities, and they also have less government-based discrimination. And so again, there's a kind of variety of checks I go through to see how sensitive this is, and those associations do seem to be pretty robust, at least based on the tests that I've done so far. One of the things that I'll mention, because this also came up from a comment from Nadine in our summer meeting, was trying to measure specifically hate speech. So more of the recent push has been this idea that, okay, free speech is great, but we need to rein it in. And so there is a measure from VDEM. It's called defamation protection. And basically what it tries to do is measure if at the national level there is a law that restricts online content, largely what we think of when we say hate speech. So when I replace that measure with the broad, instead of using the broad measure of free speech, when I use the defamation protection, it's not as correlated with our measures of minority rights protections and restricting government discrimination. And so I found that interesting that this kind of hate speech measure is not as robustly associated with more rights and protections. And then I think just kind of, what do we do with this? What does this mean? I think it does provide some evidence and speaks to the kind of channels of influence in terms of understanding how people form beliefs, and then how that informs racial progress, how it informs laws that we adopt in terms of trying to mitigate and protect different minority groups. I think it does push back at least against some of the current narrative of the way that you gain racial progress is by limiting speech. So I think that that's more of where at least the initial thought of trying to understand these associations was coming from. And I do think the results, at least what I've been able to do so far, speak to that if you are interested in trying to promote racial progress, and especially from a legal perspective, adopt laws where minority rights are protected, or there's less outright government discrimination against minority groups, then free speech is potentially a way in which to kind of counter that the narrative of what's happening. And so speaking a lot to kind of the things that was discussed in the first panel with things that are happening on college campuses, that in order to get more protections, for example, for Jewish students, free speech does seem to have this competitive element, or what we were talking about before was this kind of free exchange of ideas does seem to lead to, at least long run, more protections for minority groups.
Okay, thank you. We'll now turn to our first commenter, Professor Jones.
Well, I really enjoyed the chance to read this paper. It addresses an important question, which is it reasonable to believe that free speech causes greater racial tolerance? The author knows, that we can't say much about causation with non-experimental data. But we can test important subsets of that hypothesis. The one she really addresses in all of these regressions that she just reported is, do changes in the level of free speech within a country over time predict, or are they correlated with, greater increases in racial tolerance within that country within a year? So that's really what this is about. If you're just comparing the same country to itself over time, as the level of free speech protection in that country changes, does the amount of racial tolerance increase? And basically is more free speech associated with, at minimum, greater racial tolerance. And all of her correlations overall point in the same direction of yes, 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 yes. And she runs the regressions just the way I think a smart person would want to run this. She has many years of data from many countries, as she notes, Half of her estimates are an intra-Africa comparison, and half of her estimates are global comparisons. So she's using multiple measures of free speech, one of which is this media measure she uses within Africa, and a free speech proxy that's used for all the countries of the world. And they all keep pointing in the same general direction. So you might say at that point, well, this has established the question, right? We at least have a correlation. But of course, one thing you always wonder about, and what the author worries about, she mentions this multiple times in the paper, she says, well, we know correlation isn't causation, so is there some other story that could be causing this? We always worry about, is there some third force, sort of a wave of social progress, a wave of liberalism, a wave of sort of progressivism on some broad cultural level that would cause both of these? That's totally possible. We can't really rule that out, right? But there's another possibility that is at least worth thinking about, which is just good old-fashioned reverse causation. So if you're driving around different neighborhoods and you notice, wow, I've been driving through this neighborhood for a long time. There used to be a lot of bars on the windows, and now there aren't any bars on the windows now. And let's go see what happened to the crime rates. You'll usually find that when they take the bars off the windows, the crime rates are lower. So you would wonder which causes which. And someone who wanted to be really critical of this paper might say, well, this is just a version of saying that when people take the bars off the windows, that's causing the crime rates to go down, right? But we know what really happens is that people see the crime rates going down for a while, they're like, that seems safer than it used to be, let's take the bars off the windows. So that's always one possibility. Perhaps since we're looking at changes within the same country over time, we always have to be concerned that maybe what a government is doing is they're saying, because a lot of countries don't have free speech protections that are rigorously enforced by the courts and quite obsequiously obeyed by the bureaucracy. Instead, we have a lot of governments that are kind of turning the dial a little bit, dialing it up or dialing it down, dialing up or dialing down the level of media freedom, the level of free speech protections. And so one has to be concerned that maybe governments are saying, well, we haven't had any ethnic riots for a while, let's try a little more free speech now, I guess it's safer. It's something that she knows and we all know we can't rule out, right? But there are some things that she does to try to, that to me, assuage this concern to a substantial degree. And I'd say that my favorite one is that she just tries so many other predictors of free speech. She tries so many other predictors of good governance in her estimates. So for instance, she looks not just at whether free speech predicts racial tolerance, she notices that it predicts protection of rights, access to power, lower levels of government exclusion. So it basically is associated with a lot of good things, which does fit this idea that there's sort of a overall wave of what a classical liberal might just call liberalism, wave that rises in some countries and declines in other countries over time, and they tend to sort of move together. And with that, some part of this bundle between free speech, protection of rights, access to power, less government exclusion, something in this mix together is what generates an environment that causes the greater levels of racial tolerance that we'd all like to have. So there's the fact that all of these things move together is a common problem when I study cross-country income differences, and we kind of know all the good things go together and all the bad things kind of go together, right? And so it makes it very hard to tease out which channel is really important. But I will say this, if I wanted to point to one piece of evidence that I think of as quite important on a micro level for this, an example from Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate who studied the causes of famine. When he wanted to find out what caused, why it is that some countries stopped having famines, he looked around. He partly looked at his own experience growing up in India, but he also looked at cross-country evidence. And what he found was, he says, the way he's phrased it is that no country in the world, there's never been a famine in a democracy. There has never been a famine in a democracy. And he defines democracy very narrowly. He defines it as having two things, competitive political parties, and second one, very important for the author's paper, free speech, a free press. A free press gets the word out. So the free press gets the word out, and I personally think that getting the word out about human beings and what our neighbors are like tends to, on average, increase the amount of tolerance we have for our neighbors. Learning a little bit about who we're surrounded by makes us a little bit more tolerant of those we're surrounded by. So I would like to, when I think of what I take away from this paper, I think the correlations are clearly, obviously there. She checks it every single way that a serious person would want to look at this. We all know the limitations, but we all know that by getting more information into people's minds, it lets us know a little bit more about who we're surrounded by. If I wanted to make one little statistical request, if I were the referee on this paper, I would probably be just signing it off and being like, let's publish this. I just have a couple little questions, a couple little preferences. One is she is quite clear that her dependent variables are standardized, so they're made to sort of move between a sort of 0 to 1 range, to speak a little informally. And so it makes it easier to interpret the left-hand side variables, the dependent variables, the sort of caused variables maybe. But I couldn't tell if she did that with the right-hand side, with her free speech measure. So maybe she did, maybe she didn't. It's sometimes I might have been a poor reader on this. But if she standardizes both of them, then we can all interpret her coefficients here as correlations. And something that almost anyone who's taken even an intro stats class remembers is that they know kind of how a correlation coefficient works. I couldn't ever quite tell when these coefficients were really whether Deirdre McCloskey would say these coefficients have a lot of oomph. Are these coefficients big or small? My interpretation, my hunch is that they're a little on the medium to small side, but pointing in the right direction. I think I always keep Deirdre McCloskey's work on statistical significance in mind, and her work on the importance of emphasizing economic significance. And I saw a lot of mentions of this result's statistically significant, this one isn't, so we're basically grading by asterisk. And grading by asterisk is not something that we should be doing. That's part of the story, it's the culture we live in. It shouldn't be the whole story. I would love to have seen a few results saying, going from the 10th percentile of free speech to the 90th percentile of free speech is associated with a 20% increase in the amount of racial tolerance in the country. Just something where I can tell how big these effects are. I know those results are there. I know they'd be great to read. I know referees and people on Twitter would love to report coefficients just like that, and I'd encourage her to report her coefficients that way. I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Eugene Volokh.
Thanks very much for inviting me to this conference. I always very much enjoy it. This is in general, the initiative is a tremendously important project, and the particular problem that this paper seeks to address is also a tremendously important one. I like free speech. I generally am in favor of broad protections for free speech. I think it does a lot of good, but that's what I think. How do we know that? What if it doesn't? What if it's counterproductive? Or what if it's actually not so much counterproductive, but just a lot less relevant than we would like to think it is? So it's tremendously important to try to test these things empirically. I have to say, I have considerable reservations about what the paper tells us. They're related to the ones we've heard identified. I'm just wondering if they're ultimately considerably more serious than just that. So I think it is on towards the end of part 1, on page 5, that there are the following sentences. Free speech is likely endogenous, influenced by unobserved factors that also affect tolerance and minority rights. That there is this big picture, classical liberal project that carries with it these things and has long carried with it both of these things. There are various rival projects that carry the opposite of those, and it may very well be that it isn't free speech that's causing more protection for minority rights, or minority rights causing more protection for free speech, although maybe, as you point out, that too is possible, but just something else that's causing both. The article correctly says estimated coefficients should not be interpreted as causal. Also, survey data is prone to measurement error. Given these limitations, the goal is simply to assess whether free speech correlates with racial tolerance. So I appreciate the article's candor in explaining this, but it makes it very difficult for me to understand how the article repeatedly says things like, these results suggest that free speech fosters socially tolerant attitudes. That's just the paragraph before. Promotes minority protections and access to power, decreases government discrimination. These are just examples from the paragraph immediately before the one that says coefficients shouldn't be interpreted as causal. The goal is simply to assess whether it correlates. Likewise, I think in the oral remarks, I think we heard, and I would very much like to believe that indeed this shows that if people want want more racial tolerance on campuses, they should actually accomplish it by by promoting free speech rather than restricting free speech. But if it is indeed the case that the coefficients should not be interpreted as causal, and the goal is simply to assess correlation, I don't see how that can be asserted. So I think the article might well show this correlation. I'm not sure what by itself that correlation term shows, how useful that is, but I suppose it's good to have more knowledge, even just about correlation. But then I may be missing something, but I don't understand how the article can at the same time say things that are causal. A second point, which the author pointed out and credited quite correctly Nadine Strawson for, but I want to highlight again, is that it's not a question, do we have free speech or do we not have free speech? I mean, in some countries maybe that's so, but in general, in most of the places where people are asking such questions, the question is what kinds of speech should or should not be protected? And I like the American approach under which there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. I don't much care for the European approach, but I've got to acknowledge they have this approach. They do have a free press. They do have competitive parties and competitive elections. And the question is, even if we were to show, let's just even focus on correlation between free speech or let's say support for free speech and support for racial tolerance, how do we know that this wouldn't be exactly the same if we had support for the European model of free speech? Maybe it would even be better under the European model of free speech. So as I understand it, and I may be just misunderstanding the data, I'm not a quantitative scholar by any means, but as I understand it, the individual level questions never sought to probe that, perhaps because it is very difficult to probe, perhaps because the existing queries didn't, the existing surveys didn't probe that. But the questions were essentially, as I understand it, at least in one set, whether the media should have the right to publish any views and ideas without government control, or alternatively, the government should have the right to prevent the media from publishing things that it considers harmful to society. Now, to be sure, you could imagine someone saying, well, any views and ideas means any views and ideas, so I'll only say yes to that, say I strongly agree with that, if I really do reject a hate speech exception. But I think it's more likely that especially lay people will just say, oh, I sort of understand. Should we have mostly basically free media or mostly basically under the government's thumb? Because no country says the media really should have the right to publish any views without government control. I mean, under American law, if your view is we want you to commit this crime against this particular person tomorrow, that is unprotected. So that I think that tells us that the respondents who choose the first option are generally pro-free speech, but I don't think it tells us anything about their views on hate speech in quotation marks. Now, I appreciate that at the country level, there is this defamation and online, actually apparently just online defamation and hate speech variable that is considered. But there are two problems that I see with that. One is I tried to look up what that means. And as best I can tell, the question is, does the legal framework provide protection against defamatory online content, interesting, just online, or hate speech? Well, at least lawyers will say those are very different things. Sometimes defamation is used to refer to group defamation, saying statements that are viewed as false and reputation damaging about groups. But in American law, and I think in most European countries, the most common use of defamation, of the term defamation or its translations, is what we call libel or slander. It's saying false things. Oh, Wallach was caught with his hand in the petty cash, right? That's defamation. So an interesting question is, what do you do about a country that provides considerable protection from defamation, which many countries do, but doesn't provide protection against hate speech? The response is, maybe you'd say somewhat because it provides some protection, but in limited circumstances, or mostly. It's hard to know, and it's hard to know whether some country which rates somewhat that way does that because it provides broad protection against traditional libel and not against hate speech, or broad protection against hate speech but not against traditional libel, or for that matter, specifically online defamation. So I'm not sure the underlying variable is terribly helpful. I'm open to persuasion. I mean, I could look, if somebody could point me to a list of countries ranked by that, and then I could call up some experts and see, well, what are those countries like? Maybe it actually, despite what strikes me as really quite poor wording, it does capture correctly this question of whether they prohibit, again, supposed hate speech or not. But it's just not clear to me that this is so. And again, here maybe I just didn't properly read the paper, but it wasn't completely clear to me what the paper said about, or what the paper discovered about, well, one might think of an important question, which is, what about the countries that take the European model? What about the countries that essentially provide broad free speech protection minus hate speech protection? Because if we see the same result there, or maybe even a slightly stronger correlation, and again, I'm quite open to being told you didn't look properly at table number 7. But if we see that, or maybe we see no meaningful correlation no statistically significant correlation, simply because maybe we just don't have enough data points to establish that, then we might say, it doesn't tell us much about this question about hate speech specifically, as opposed to the bigger picture. Do we have fundamentally a European model, or do we have fundamentally a Chinese model? Whatever the difference between us and Europe, they're a lot smaller than between either of us and China, let's say. So those are my main concerns. I should add also, there are times when, and maybe this is normal in some of the social science literature, and maybe I'm being naive or pedantic as a lawyer here, but there are times when the article seems to draw some distinctions that strike me as odd. So, for example, there is a statement that Miller and Schwartz document that social media heightened anti-Muslim hate crimes following Trump's rise in politics, not by changing beliefs, but by normalizing hateful behavior among those already inclined toward prejudice. Again, maybe I'm being pedantic, but normalizing hateful behavior is a form of changing beliefs, right? I mean, just to take an example, imagine it was somewhere else, it was a different political valence, and there were more Antifa violence against people they perceive as fascist or pro-Trump or whatever else. And it's because all of these people were saying, yes, you should punch Nazis, yes, violence is justified and such. I mean, presumably it won't be, former MAGA people who've now become Antifa as a result. It would be people who are already on that side who have become radicalized. But I don't think we'd say that operated not by changing beliefs. It presumably did change beliefs about the propriety of violent behavior. Again, I may be being pedantic here, but I do think it's important, if we're going to draw distinctions, to draw the right distinctions. Likewise, there are a couple of places where the article talks about whether the receivers of communications are rational or persuaded by emotional appeal. There was another example which I don't have handy right now, but basically that was a distinction drawn. It seems like an odd distinction. Very few of us are entirely rational, I like to think. Maybe some people in this audience, well trained in law and economics and philosophy and such. Very few. Very few of us are entirely emotional, I would think. Most important political movements contain both a rational and emotional component. So it just seems odd to draw that distinction. There are a couple of other such examples, but again, I'm risking here descending into pedantry. But the bigger picture problem, I do think, is one that, again, maybe I'm missing something, but if the article does indeed only show correlation, even given the time sequence, unless you have a particular kind of time sequence where 10 years after liberalization of free speech, you generally start seeing extra racial equality. That would be great. I don't think that that's the kind of thing that the article tries to see or purports to show. Absent that, I'm just not sure how all of these claims about fosters, promotes, and the like can be sustained.
Thank you, Eugene. Professor Williamson, would you like to respond at all, or provide some additional comments, or?
Sure. Yeah, I can provide some insight. I think can be helpful to clarify the very helpful comments. So, picking up where we left off with Eugene, I think some of it is just language and being a product of my discipline, but that doesn't mean that I can't be more clear. And so at times when we say in writing up regression results, it's suggestive of this. That is the kind of qualifying language of, hey, we know that we can't 100% establish causality, especially with this type of setup. Without a natural experiment, you really can't speak to it much, but it's suggestive that free speech underpins tolerance. It's suggestive of, and so I think it would be helpful to go back and make sure that those qualifying statements are indeed qualified and that there's not the overreach that says it's causal or that that's what the results are saying, when indeed that is not something that we can speak to, as in most empirical work in social sciences. It's more identifying the associations and then trying to understand why this may happen. That's so important, why theory and history go together. So theory and data need to go together. Which brings me to one point about the two types of models. There is an entire and rather interesting and involved literature on persuasive communication. I encourage each of you to start looking into this. And the economists, of course, that's where my go-to, are kind of pulling from psychology work, sociology work, and this is very interdisciplinary of how now it's been categorized as two broad models for persuasive communication. More rational approach, we would consider Bayesian updating. So that's where more information is, we're able to sort kind of truth from fiction. And education plays a role in that the more educated you are, the more incentivized you are to sort truth from fiction. So that's kind of one way of viewing free speech and how it's going to affect our beliefs. And then on another end is more this emotional appeal argument, what they call preference-based models. And it's not so much that in that case you're not rational, it's that you're not incentivized to figure out truth from fiction. And that's where I pulled in a recent paper published by a set of economists who look at Trump's tweets about, so anti kind of Muslim tweets, and then that they show that there's on those days or subsequent days, more of an increase of violence toward Muslims. And they do qualify the results, that it is not taking the average American and then they read Trump's tweets and then they're like, and now I don't like Muslims and I'm going to go attack them. It's actually kind of creating this focal point of, I already believed, or my bias was I didn't like this group of individuals and now I feel more empowered to act on it. So it is qualified in this persuasive communication and how economists are using that. But given the kind of goal of this project within the Symposium, broadly speaking, it may be more helpful to kind of spell that out and kind of tease through those types of models or way of thinking about things. It's also the way that the results on Nazi Germany and the Rwanda genocide are being classified, in that the people who acted out in violence are the ones who were already holding more pro-Nazi beliefs or anti-Jewish beliefs. And the propaganda just, in some sense, you can think of it, it amplified it. And in cases in Germany that were less anti-Jewish, you actually saw less violence towards Jews in those areas. So I think there's a way to pull that into just honestly our broader understanding of how free speech affects attitudes and then how it affects behavior. But the point about the economic significance absolutely holds. There's larger economic significance with the country level results. And so the baseline is about a standard deviation increase in free speech affects these minority rights by about a third of a standard deviation. So that's somewhat sizable. But the individual level results is more of a smaller effect, but you're right, it should definitely be discussed and more clear. I think a lot of the comments is just for writing and clarity, which I appreciate. We can always be more clear. And so I think some of it's just qualifying and thinking through what we can say and what we can't say. The last thing I'll say on this is I think some of Eugene's comments speak to trying to figure out another paper, which is more, and this is what Professor Jones was getting to as well, is there some sort of experiment, a natural experiment throughout history of you get either a huge shift in free speech protections or you get a huge decline, and then we can actually track that over time. From my knowledge of the data on attitudes, that wouldn't be possible just yet. There's just not enough tracking of countries over time. Those surveys aren't repeated enough, but you may be able to do it on a national scale in terms of what happens with their legal protections. And so I think it would be worthwhile for me to try to explore countries who have had major shifts, not these kind of gradual shifts, which speaks more to like a modernization theory. So if you are experiencing more economic growth, we tend to liberalize more across a bunch of different margins. But if there's some other, person comes into power and boom, you see this major shift in free speech or laws, at least regarding free speech. And then you can see are there other subsequent effects from that. I think that, of course, that would be fascinating and an amazing complement to the narrative that's at least emerging from this work.
Thank you. It occurs to me as I'm listening to all this, there's another aspect of free speech which isn't directly implicated by the paper, but one theory of why allowing hate or why one should tolerate hate speech or other extremist speech is sort of the idea that we let people sort of blow off steam, like rather that if you don't let people speak and express their views, they have no outlet in the democratic system for being able to express those views. They will act out in violence because that's their only choice. I don't know if anyone has empirically studied that, but I think that would be a related, really interesting topic to see whether that's actually true or not. Whether, for example, countries with very strict hate speech laws that are otherwise kind of similar to countries that don't have those hate speech laws experience more extremist violence because of the lack of opportunity for the extremists to get their viewpoints out any other way. In any event, I would like to turn things over to the audience if anyone hopefully has some questions about this very provocative paper.
Hi, Brendan Dooley here from Mount St. Mary's University. One thing that might be in the crosstabs and the regression models here might be a little revealing. I have a question about the heterogeneity of the, or the lack thereof, in the domains that you're drawing from. We've seen massive migration shifts over the course of time, and I wonder if that would capture anything, and if there's a story to tell about that. The reality of being able to meet someone from a different race or an ethnic culture, and oftentimes that creates a sort of a reaction on the part of governmental authorities. And then there's the issue that Professor Bernstein is talking to here as well in terms of the rise of alt-right and other movements, et cetera.
Any takers for that? Okay.
I would have thought the author, maybe. I would love to hear what she has.
I think it's a great idea to look into interacting with people of another race or culture or ethnicity, other languages. I don't have an immediate thought on how to go about doing that. Maybe more of a case study approach. You can track. There's ways to track more throughout history migration patterns at a broad scale, but I don't know if we can track then how much they're interacting with natives or people of other groups. But yeah, it's a great idea.
I would think one difficulty is often it's very hard to kind of figure out just from, say, the numbers, like what the nature of the interaction was. First of all, some different situations, people may live closer or further from the majority, may live apart or may live integrated. Also, sometimes there are meetings of groups that are happy and some that are not, and it's often difficult to know for sure because they're often a mix of those.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's a famous paper by Robert Putnam that indicates that heterogeneity or diversity actually increases or enhances the prospect of friction.
Oh, right. You could certainly see why it would.
So there has to be an opportunity before there is.
Right. I think the opposite of it, pluribus unum.
Yeah, I mean, that's the title of his paper.
Oh,
It's
okay,
ironic.
good, got it. Funny.
He's the
I
paper
didn't.
title
Right.
ironically.
But at the same time, I mean, I do think it is often the case that you could tell a persuasive story that it's the other way around. That once you sort of interact with people in certain ways, you see the benefits of mutual exchange and the like. And I think it may very well be that different kinds of regimes are more or less conducive to that.
I'll take a moderate prerogative, just throw in that I don't know if anyone has studied this either, but anecdotally it seems that increases in interracial marriage and so forth lead to tolerance, because now you have relatives, people have very strong tribal instincts that who's a member of their tribe. If you have relatives, I mean, it really struck me when my book about racial classifications came out. I had a PR person who got me on all sorts of podcasts and small radio stations, and some of the people I was with were, the people you would think of, let's just say, stereotypically as American. This would be someone who might be extremely racist, just by various demographic factors, let's say. And what was remarkable is even people who would most fit that stereotype, when we start talking about racial classifications, they would almost inevitably say, which you wouldn't have heard 30 or 50 years ago, well, my wife is Mexican, or, my brother married a black girl, or whatever. And then you just sort of knew, okay, well, now we can talk about this without any presumption that there's sort of underlying hostility there, because these are members of the family. So I found that very interesting. And again, if anyone out of the audience is looking for research papers, the influence of interracial relationships on the prejudices of both the people who get married and the people who love them that are related to them, I think would be very interesting. Another aspect of liberalism. More questions? Nadine.
Thank you for this really important paper, Claudia, and thank you for addressing my question. I find all the economic analysis, quite frankly, way over my head, but I'm going to bring it home to my husband, who is an economist. But I just want to emphasize how helpful empirical research that could suggest a causal relationship would be. In the absence of that, I think each of us can interpret the correlations in diametrically opposite ways. I had a very dramatic experience with that a few years ago. I debated Vera Jourova, who is the EU official who's responsible for what I would call censorship. She would call protecting minorities. And she cheerfully agreed with all of the correlational data I had about how various European countries, strict enforcement of very strict anti-hate speech laws had correlated with an increase in reported incidents of discriminatory violence against various minority groups, including Jews and refugees and others. And whereas my conclusion was, well, this shows that these laws don't work, her conclusion was that shows that we need more of these laws. And I just don't know if there is a way that, if it's possible to design a study that can address those questions. I'm really agnostic as to whether that's even possible. But it also occurs to me that one kind of correlational study that would be really interesting, and again, I think it would be subject to a certain kind of interpretation, is the laws that exist in these countries. How many of them, and when did the laws enter into effect? Anti-discrimination laws and laws against hate speech. I raise that because I was just astounded to learn fairly recently that Germany, which basically never stopped enforcing anti-hate speech laws. They exist during the Weimar Republic. Maybe they were revamped in the 1980s, but not basically changed. Until the very end, or maybe until the 21st century, did not have anti-discrimination laws, and only enacted those when the EU demanded that they do so. And so at the very least, we might then be able to make an argument that you shouldn't enact anti-hate speech laws unless you've tried to outlaw discriminatory violence and discriminatory conduct. Oh, and to you, David, the Future of Free Speech, Jakob Changama, have done a couple of really interesting studies that I think they say they say it's correlational only, but very detailed, that violence decreases with increased free speech and increases with increased censorship. If you go to the Future of Free Speech website, you'll see a couple of very detailed studies.
And I should say, Nadine, this is a very, very basic sort of empiricism, but people always say, well, if we only had hate speech laws, the Nazis would have never taken power. And Nadine said, well, they actually researched it. There were hate speech laws, but when you point out, again, I've gotten the reaction, well, they just needed stronger hate speech laws. So you can never really win that. Debbie.
Claudia, I'm fascinated by the paper's focus on comparing amongst countries. And I'm thinking about our situation here in the United States, where we do have fairly robust free speech protections, yet there is a sense that our social norms are slipping and that there is some kind of deterioration of discourse in our country. And so I'm a little stumped when I think about that, and I'm thinking about your paper. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so as Professor Jones did summarize, it is the way that the model is set up is that it's looking within country changes. So that's when we say we use overtime. So when we use country and year fixed effects, that's what we're doing, is stripping away kind of the reason why to do that is it can help to control for all of these unobserved factors that can be affecting, for example, racial tolerance. But what it does is that you're only comparing within a country over time. So it's no more narrow. It's a more robust in some sense, but it's also more narrow. But if you take out the country fixed effects, the associations still hold. But I think there's maybe a way of getting at your question, partly because people are going to be interested in what's happening in the U.S. And so comparing the World Values Survey and the results within the U.S. over time, and then actually taking some like Pew survey results or Gallup poll results from the U.S., not exactly comparable, but to see if it's actually kind of painting the same picture. What is happening over time? Is it more of a media narrative that we hear, but actually people's beliefs are on average that we are more tolerant, more open? I I don't know. It seems from some of the Pew and Gallup survey results I was reading earlier on when I started this project was that people seem to be more in favor of speech restriction, but I don't see a lot of evidence favoring less tolerance toward other ethnic groups. And even with immigrants, most of the survey results show that people are more open than what we would hear, at least in the media. So maybe there's a way of, which is interesting given that we're talking about free speech. So maybe there's a way to like piece all of that together for a paper kind of within the U.S. and studying some of those results over time.
Any additional questions? Do we have any other, are there any remarks that have been brought up that the commenters would like to elaborate on?
Yeah, I've thought about what I wish I could see as some extra results here. And the point I addressed was we don't know in part whether there's this sort of big cloud of progressivism that created both the protection of free speech and the greater racial tolerance. And one way to check for that would just be to use the author's large set of other controls that she uses as dependent variables and make them predictive variables. Switch variables from the left to the right. So in other words, one way to put this is people love a horse race. And she's right now not really running a horse race. She's just checking to see, do countries with more free speech, does a country with more free speech tend to have more racial tolerance? She could easily run a horse race, checking to see if you run a horse race between free speech, protection of rights, and access to power, which of those does the best job predicting racial tolerance, right? Those would be interesting. She's got a lot of control variables. There's a lot of cross-country databases on this. It'd be easy to check and see, even with the data she has, just pop it into Stata right now, to check and see what is the best predictor of racial tolerance. If you know about the protection of rights in the country, does a higher or lower level of free speech still help predict more racial tolerance? Because it would be interesting and I think more persuasive to the audience to find out if it turns out to be the case that free speech is the great and grand predictor of greater levels of racial tolerance.
I would also, thinking about this, add that I think there's two different ways that freedom of speech could, in some sense, cause greater racial tolerance. And one would be that free speech itself and open debate leads to discovery about other people and more tolerance. It could also just be that liberalism in some sense is a package, that when people's attitudes liberalize, they liberalize broadly, including on things like government censorship and racial tolerance, and that there's that relationship, which wouldn't be causal in the same sense, but it would be the way of saying it's like sort of a package deal. Just off the top of my head, it's hard to think of a country that is generally repressive but has really good inter-ethnic relations. And why is that? There does seem to be something about liberalism as a general mentality or cultural attitude that is helpful.
The conventional wisdom, I thought, was maybe Yugoslavia. That somehow Tito managed to, through pretty firm hand, not as firm as Stalin's, but pretty firm hand, keep at least, maybe didn't make people love each other, but at least keep people from killing each other.
Or he was just keeping the lid on it.
Pardon? Right. Well, if it's I'm sorry, Singapore. I don't know about Oh, actually, right. I guess. Right. I guess that's a fair point. That is an example of what's generally thought to be a relatively well-functioning, lots of Malays, Indians, and Chinese. I mean, Malays and Chinese especially.
If you visit Singapore, my impression when I visited Singapore is the official story of the really happy, complete equality among the different groups was not quite true, but
very few official stories are.
Yeah. Anyway, that concludes this particular session. We will now have a half-hour break for lunch. Thank you to our paper author and our commenters.